My name's Nicholas Budimir. I'm going to be taking you through a little bit more of labor history. I think last week we enjoyed ourselves with Michael Johnston. The only thing, I think we need to fill in a few holes and gaps in labor history. What I'm going to try to do, I'm going to try to do two things for you folks today. I'm going to try to fill some gaps in labor history. But first, what I want to do is give you a little bit of a layout of the employment relationship as sort of standard industrial relations practitioners talk about. So I'll talk to you maybe about 5 or 10 minutes about this modern labor relations concept. I know we've been focusing mostly on history, and then I want to get into some of the fill-ins on history, at least get us up to about the 1930s, because there's some very important strikes, historical events, some little thing called World War I and the Ludlow Massacre that we really need to touch on, and we haven't got to. So just about up to the big upsurge of labor I'll bring you up to. So far in this lecture series, we've been talking a lot about history. I want to sort of jump way forward to sort of like current thinking about labor relations. And this one writer, I think it's 2004, John Budd, it's not Budimir, it's Budd, that's B-U-D-D. And he sort of imagines the employment, the labor relations field like a pie with 3 pieces. Pie. I love pie. So traditionally, labor relations has always been thought of from one standpoint, and that's the standpoint of efficiency. Now, the efficiency side of the pie is the concern of the employer, the entrepreneur, the capitalist, or what is our word, students, that you just read about? The bourgeoisie, right? So the efficiency side is the employer, the entrepreneur, the innovator, the capitalist, or the bourgeoisie. And their view of efficiency is rational production. Increasing the rate, increasing the quality, increasing the dynamism of the production process. So basically, interested in maximizing profits, minimizing losses. So very much the neoclassical view of economics. But what John Budd is talking about, he's trying to bring other pieces of the pie in. And this is where sort of what they call collaborative labor relations sort of brings into the, you know, you can say it's blueberry and lemon meringue or something like that, right? So what Budd is talking about is that the other slices of the pie are things like equity. And equity is not really brought up in the concerns with efficiency. Concerns about equity are really brought up in the negotiating process, in the struggle process, in the process of collective bargaining with labor unions. So unions are, for Budd, a very important part of this piece of employment relations, bringing equity to the workforce, bring the feeling that your work is well rewarded. So from the perspective of workers, employees, or from what you guys read, thank you, Patrick, the proletarians, right? Saying it from Marx's point of view, right? But now we're looking at a workforce that is much more balanced in terms of its outcomes. So you bring in equity, you bring in the concerns of quote-unquote fair pay for a fair day's work. But also it doesn't stop there at equity. You also bring in, I couldn't think of a flavor for this. I guess it's orange meringue, I don't know. And that's voice. So what John Budd's theory is that proper labor relations, proper industrial relations should somehow balance the efficiency desires, or it should be on this side, the efficiency desires of employers, entrepreneurs, and capitalists, the equity desires, I guess it's on this side of the pie, the equity desires of workers, labor unions, and community members, and the voice. What is the voice? No, it's not the TV show The Voice, right? But it's the idea that other people, workers, whether they're assembly line workers, teachers, or frontline nurses, have a say, have a stake in the process of production, and also community members. So his vision is to bring a balance to this pie and not only have the pie be this slice. So sort of neoclassical economics would view the employment relationship as merely efficiency, the need for productivity, and Budd's vision, and I think labor history bears him out, is that it is much more of a balancing of these three concepts. Another question, sort of this first part of theoretical, what is it that labor unions do? And sort of the most basic definition is that they either bargain, or they, in some cases, struggle, or in some cases negotiate over this basic, the terms and conditions of employment. What is the wage rate and what's going on in that factory, schoolhouse, nursing home facility, under what conditions do you remove the tables from a room? There were tables here just before we began here, and unionized workers removed them. A little aside to that, those unionized workers had to take quite a pay freeze over the next several years. Just a little, so you know what's being done to keep the process of even this classroom going. A second thing is that what unions do, they provide the other two pieces of Budd's employment puzzle. They provide that equity and voice. Now, you can be argued that equity and voice can be achieved by other methods, and I'd be happy to discuss some of those. But in most of the industrial world, equity and voice has been achieved through different forms of negotiation or struggle, right? The organization of workers. And finally, another thing that unions do is that they aren't just an economic vehicle, right, to gain better wages and working conditions. They're actually another building block of a democratic society, democratic institutions in a society, right? And one thing that sociologists know is that the sort of building blocks, the participation in democratic institutions is whittling away. There's less and less democratic participation in society. Fewer people participate in the Lions Club. Fewer people participate in the Rotary Club. Fewer people volunteer. So our civic associations, if you read the book Bowling Alone, not Bowling for Columbine, but Bowling Alone, it talks about sort of the collapse of civic engagement. So in a civically minded society, unions are one of many pillars of civic engagement. Forgive me for getting a little bit into economics here. So I want to give you the neoclassical version of what's going on in the employment relationship, and a little bit outside. So the market, what I would call market forces and non-market forces. And this is what's working on the workplace today. So I'm not going to go very in depth. I just want to hit a few major points here. So what is determining the workforce? What is determining the relative power of workers and employers, of unions and bosses in the workplace? And among the market forces that we're talking about is labor supply. How many workers are there? And are they skilled or unskilled? That's sort of this major supply and demand issue that we're always working with, and labor demand. So if you simply take the classical economic approach, very, very, very 101 or beginner level, is that how many workers do you need, and how many is the economy supplying? Other things sort of a necessary component of this, especially in the modern era, is that labor is supposedly free to contract. It's supposedly free to move and supposedly free to decide. That means it can decide to take a contract or not. How most of us understand it is through the, what's the term? I'm missing the term right now. Oh boy, why am I missing the name? At-will employment. So the doctrine of at-will employment is this: you're free to move in, free to move out, you're free to work here as long as you want, and I'm free to employ you for as long as you want. So that's sort of neoclassical economics. In labor, in modern capitalism, you have this theoretical idea that labor is free, and it's free to do that. There's a few caveats to this, is that in reality or sociologically, individuals are not free. They have families, they have community ties, etc., and those will be on the other side with the non-market forces. So, I mean, one simplistic example here is that if you have a high demand area, let's say computer programmers, and you have a total dearth of computer programmers, they would have a high wage. So if you simply take the economic viewpoint, high wages would be commanded by very highly skilled employees, and low wages, well, you have low wages because you have low skills or low demand. Now, to add to this picture, you want to add non-market forces that often in neoclassical economics doesn't get talked about. In sociology, we talk about non-market forces. Culture and community, right? Whatever the values, whatever the expectations, norms, whatever the culture of the people that you're talking about has a huge determinant on how free the labor is, right? Gender relations impinges upon this supposedly free individual. Race relations impinges on the supposedly free movement of labor. So market forces are kind of reduced by these so-called non-market forces, especially culture, cultural practices, norms, values. Religion is a huge determinant of non-market forces. Whether you're Protestant or Catholic, that has an impact on how family-oriented a particular group or culture may be. How much your community is stable. Right? How stable your community is, how devoted you are to community or civic virtues, that will also be a non-market force determining the mobility, the ability to move, and the motivation of labor. Labor might say, I just can't work 12 hours because we have cultural customs that demand that we spend so many hours in church, in mosque, in synagogue, or in temple, and that we just can't possibly work the 10, 12, whatever hours that we've talked about. Also, another non-market force that you have to talk about is coercive power, right? The sword, the strike, or other elements of force. So they could be capitalist, they could be state, or they could be union coercive power. So the unions can be extremely coercive, but also the capitalist state and capitalists and entrepreneurs can also be very coercive. And the thing is, sort of this side of the board augments the sort of free and clean economics that's going on over here. All right, so that was sort of just a little overview, little economic overview. And a little overview of a few forces determining the employment relationship. And I really think to sort of balance things out, think about the three pieces of the pie, sort of balancing equity, voice, and efficiency in the workplace. All right, so now I want to sort of jump from that employment relationship back into history So we're going to kind of pick up back here in about the 1880s, 1890s. And certainly during the Civil War, if we're remembering, there was a great boom, great need for labor. But after the Civil War, there was kind of a bust, right? Because nobody needed all those the guns and ammo anymore. So there was a brief post-Civil War bust, economic downturn. But then it picked up again later on in the century. There was what's called the 1873 panic. And oh my God, what happened? The economy took a long 20-year downturn, sort of the global economy from about 1873 to right around 1896 or so. But during this period in the United States, we know about massive railroad construction, steel and mining. This is kind of a classic photograph here of a worker. It's probably from about the 1930s, but it sort of encapsulates what's going on. Also, by the end of the 19th, we're into the 20th century now. The United States is quickly becoming an industrial monopoly imperial power. So U.S. is fast catching up to Britain and Germany. Even by this time, U.S. is probably the second economic power in the world. Britain is still first. And producer and consumer demand for all kinds of materials, not only steel, but rubber. There was a giant rubber boom in Brazil that really vastly facilitated sort of global economic expansion. So, like, just ending the 19th century, two strikes are kind of interesting to juxtapose. The first one, this takes us back to sort of some of our racial issues. The first one takes place in New Orleans, and the second one takes place in good old Homestead, Pennsylvania. This first one in New Orleans was one of the earliest what's called general strikes in history. It took about 25,000 workers from about 49 different unions. And what's really interesting about the New Orleans general strike, black and white workers. Remember, it's New Orleans, Louisiana, the South in the 1890s. Black and white workers are working together. These are longshoremen or dock workers who are now working together, and all the other unions kind of pour out in favor of them, and they take a strong stance against wage cuts. A lot of their wages were being cut by employers, saying that sales on the Mississippi were drastically decreased at that time. Now, the outcome of this general strike, it shut down New Orleans for about 4 to 5 days. The outcome was that they won some wages, but they lost all of their unionization. All of their organization crumbled. Now, the interesting thing, I looked at 3 different sources. My mentors, Color of Politics by Michael Goldfield. Where's the other one? From the folks who brought you the weekend, and the New Orleans State Labor History site. Each one gave me a totally different outcome of this strike. One of them said the workers were crushed by state power. Another one said the workers were victorious. And a third one said basically the workers won some wages but were demobilized. So I think the third one is the most accurate. The workers were not killed or shot by anyone, but the governor did threaten violence in this in the last days of the strike. So the dock workers they took their small wage concessions and they sort of departed. So this is what kind of broke the 1892 New Orleans strike. Same year over in Homestead, Pennsylvania, right closer to home here, at one of Carnegie's giant steel mills. In Homestead, Pennsylvania, there was a decision to get rid of the Amalgamated Steel and Iron Workers, which was a minority union in this plant, only about 800 workers out of 4,000. Carnegie and his director decided to go non-union. The Amalgamated Union said, no, we're not going to take that. They went on strike, and all the non-union workers, a lot of these were immigrant workers from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, they all went out on strike. Excuse me. Look at what's there. Don't do what I say. They were locked out. They didn't go on strike. After their lockout, what they ended up doing, they formed these massive organizing committees, and they armed themselves. The governor and the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which was hired by Carnegie, they were armed as well. So pretty soon, between the factory strikers and the detective agencies and the state forces, quite a showdown came down. Pinkerton Detective Agency started to smuggle in scabs. The workers attacked the detective agency. And what do I have here? There was a gunfight. 7 workers die. 3 Pinkerton detectives were killed. So this is, I mean, these are not small-scale lockdowns. This is a massive fight, a bloody fight with guns. The entire town was out in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Hundreds of Pinkertons were involved in this. After this, the workers felt that this was just a crushing defeat. And there was no new organizing in the steel industry until the great upsurge of the 1930s. So this sort of defeat in Homestead really kind of crushed the steel organizing for about 30 to 35 years. So sort of the lesson here is that the great amount of the application of violence can really deter sort of long-term organizing. And I have some... remember, at the time, photographs are relatively rare. So this is a photograph from Homestead, a photograph of state militia arriving, and then a cartoon or a drawing image that's colorized of some of the burning buildings, and just to give you a sense of the mass of people and armed workers that took part in the Homestead strike. Few years later, so look at this, squeezed into the 1890s, massive amounts of labor unrest. Only about 2 miles, about 3.5 hours from here, the Pullman strike in Chicago. This is actually now a photograph of workers going out. Now, Pullman created, this is good old George Pullman here. What Pullman did, he built a massive sort of empire on this, of these luxury railway cars. But Pullman was interesting because he had this utopian vision of doing something great for the workers. And what he did was he built this whole town. You can still visit it. If you're on your way to Chicago, you drive by it basically after you hit the Gary Works, which we'll talk about here in a second. You'll pass through Calumet. And just to the south is where Pullman, and you can go and buy your own little house in Pullman, and it's still there. But it was supposed to be a model town where all the workers lived perfect little lives, and the company, Pullman's company, owned all of the buildings, and he would charge you rent, sort of like these company towns, but it was supposed to be a model company town. The yards were well tended. There was a Pullman school. There's a Pullman elementary. There was a Pullman opera house. He built a church there. I have some Google pictures to show you in a second. So what happened? Sorry, I should have animated this, but I didn't, dummy. What the Pullman workers, they felt that their wages were way too low to compensate for their living conditions. Basically, they were exchanging all of their wages for the tightly controlled housing that Pullman had. They decide to go on strike, and the local attorneys under the Sherman Antitrust Act have an injunction against the workers. So they accuse the workers of monopoly. Right? They had a monopoly on labor. So under the Sherman Antitrust Act, they impose an injunction. Federal troops were called by Grover Cleveland. Here's a little illustration of this strike. It was led by a four-time candidate for president, Eugene V. Debs, and his American Railway Union. 25 of civilians were killed in the violence. Debs was arrested, spent about a year in prison, and the American Railway Union collapses. And if you're into Google, and if you're into traveling to Chicago, I know definitely George is, my good buddy George up there, you can still go to Pullman. And if you can look here, I'm not sure how clear it is, this is where Pullman is, right? Up there, just in the corner, is south side of Chicago. So if you're driving to Chicago on I-90, that's where it is. And if you go to Pullman, you can still see, let's see if I can find it here, you can still see the factory and the church that he built. If you just kind of pull it right here. And this is the beautiful, it's actually nice when you look at it here. There's the factory where the Pullman strike was. And right across the street, it's now shuttered. Right across the street, you can see these are the houses here. These are the beautiful little houses. They're actually quite nice. They look really nice now. They might not have been so nice to live in when George Pullman sort of told you, you can't drink in them. You have to go to bed at a certain time. So your life was really tightly controlled. But Pullman is still there. This model utopian town is still kind of there, just in, oh, come on now. There you go. And those are those Pullman houses built in 1894. So the Pullman strike was really clearly another huge sort of episode in American labor history running up to the 20th century. Now, I did promise you, so just a few miles away from Pullman are the Gary Works, and this is right into the 20th century. The Gary Works, this gigantic steel colossus, is being constructed. And this is to give you an idea of what kind of massive building efforts are going on in the early 20th century. On the left is the construction of the sort of retaining wall. On the right, you see the beginning of the blast furnaces. This is a hospital. This is an office on the left and a hospital. These are still in use. The hospital on your right was constructed because there were so many injuries on the job, they had to have an on-site hospital. And if you drive on I-90 past the Gary Works, you still see these buildings. How many have driven to Chicago recently? You recognize that building on the left? It's sort of like the height of the freeway now. You kind of pass this roof on the way. So those are still there. And they were constructed about 1908, I believe the site was telling me. Here's a steel crew. In 1914, they had none of the safety gear that we know about today. None of these asbestos gloves or anything like that. Very, very meager safety gear at this period of time. There were no shower facilities. Right? Steel is an extremely hot and dangerous activity to sort of work around in the heat. There were just temporary showers, sort of these, shoddily constructed showers. It took another 10 years to get permanent showers there. Workers' housing, 1915, this sort of wooden tenement housing right around southern Chicago, Calumet. Here's a great picture of the blast furnace from 1913, giant scale. Still, if you drive through Gary, Indiana today, you can see these gigantic Gary Works. And in 1967, they had this continuous processor that was built there. And there's Gary works still working. I was checking it out on Google Maps, and you can see the whole thing. You can see all of the sort of black soot around the sort of along the lake shore. It's very interesting. I won't go in too much more. Now since we're in the 20th century here, we've got a couple of things going on. We still have the Federation of Labor, and the Federation of Labor, remember, it's still the American Federation of Labor, AFL, is still mainly interested in craft unions, bricklayers and carpenters and boiler makers, right? Skilled tradesmen, and was not very interested in the other types of workers, not really interested in semi or unskilled workers, not interested very much in talking to African Americans or Latinos, not very interested in in talking to women, in fact excluding many of these folks. The Socialist Party and the IWW were sort of a alternative political organizing instrument. IWW was focusing on this one big unionism. And so if you kind of judge the power of labor in the early 20th century, it's on the low side. It's on the low side. It's struggling. There's quite a powerful spirit there, but it's quite weak and limited. We're looking at about 10% of the labor force organized, so still 90% unorganized. So at this period of time, we have coal mining operations out west, massive coal and silver mining operations, and one of the famous episodes of this history is the Ludlow Massacre of 1913-1914. And what happened was this mine company in southern Colorado had locked out its workers. Its workers had constructed sort of these tent colonies outside of the mine. The mine owners were bringing labor up from Mexico, escorted by armed guards into the mines. And so what the mine workers, the thousands of mine workers had done is they constructed these great tent colonies, and they were holding a strike trying to block the entrance to the mines. Quite a great deal of violence ensued, at first at the hands of another Pinkerton detective agency which was employed here. A famous picture of Mother Mary Jones, who was sort of a champion of the United Mine Workers here in Denver. Here's a great picture of armed strikers. So always when you're thinking about mining, for whatever reason, well, there's a lot of good reasons, in the mining industry, there's quite acrimonious and very strong fights. So there's a lot of very strong fights, even into the 1970s. When we look at the film Harlan County, it's always a bloody struggle in mining. But also we have the state militia with machine guns. So mining is not the strikes and the labor struggles in mining have been extremely bloody, extremely violent, and their repression has been extremely violent, extremely bloody. On one night, the state militia moves in, thinking they're going to move out this tent colony, and what happens is they start throwing kerosene onto the tent colony, and we understand, unbeknownst perhaps to the militia, people would dig under to try to hide from bullets that were being shot at them. What ended up happening was 10 children and 2 women were burned up in this massive fire that ensued, and you can see sort of the destruction. This is all after the tent colony had burned, and this is one of the holes where women and children were found burned. Other people were killed in gunfire, And finally, what happens? Federal troops arrive. Federal troops behave themselves. It was the state militia that was extremely ill-behaved. After federal troops arrive, the strike fund basically gives up, and the miners more or less return to work. I'm going to just cover one more labor thing, kind of bring us up to about the 1920s or 30s. As a result of Ludlow, of Homestead, of other strikes of the time period, the Lawrence textile strike, entering into the 19-teens, if you kind of look at this chart here, the blue line is union membership in the 19-teens, and as we move into the 1930s, you see what's coming up is the giant explosion of union membership in the 1930s and 40s, and then what we've experienced today is the long decline of labor from about the 1950s up until the 2000s. So, I mean, to fast forward a little bit, we come down to a point, this only brings you up to 2000, where the labor movement is right around 12%. We're at 11.3 now, so very close to levels that were experienced back in the 19-teens. So that's where we're at about right now. And what this chart also gives you is the ratio of income of Americans at the top 10% of the income level to sort of the bottom 90, and in a way they're inversely proportional. As labor union organization increases, the distribution of income or the unequal distribution of income decreases. So just a little bit of idea, where the labor movement was, where it's going to go, and where it's going to come down, sort of in our generation. George sort of mentioned this as well. We're coming up to World War I. Massive influx of workers into war industry, and during World War I, we have a this uptick of labor union membership. At the end of the war, we had quite a deal of sort of radicalism and sort of anti-war radicalism and labor radicalism. And as we're coming into the end of the war, we have labor's sort of assault and then the counterattack against labor, and sort of the breaking of the IWW in 1919, and then as Michael Goldfield says, between 1920 and 1933, this long continuous decline in union membership up until about 1933. So sort of this last hurrah, which is a very interesting strike, is the 1919 Seattle general strike, and this is really properly the only or the first general strike in American history by longshoremen. So we kind of covered two groups. We covered mining, which was a very militant group of workers, and also longshoremen or dock workers are also an extremely militant group. And this was in Seattle, of course. So why were the Seattle strikers, why did they call this general strike of all the unions? Well, the wartime government put a sort of a cap on wages. Free price controls on wages. And there was very high inflation during World War I. And the strike ended up having about 65,000 participants. That meant the dock workers, the longshoremen, plus many other locals. And both the IWW and Socialist Party was involved in this. And this was an interracial strike. Japanese workers' associations sided with the longshoremen and other strikers, so it wasn't another form of sort of interracial organizing on the docks. They really end up shutting down the entire city. But in response to this, the country kind of goes into a big Red Scare, because remember, just 2 years before, you had revolution in Russia. So what ended up happening is the Seattle General Strike gets tied to impending Russian communism. I like to do that voice because that sounds like the old movies. And the police and military sort of get involved here. Oop, I doubled that, sorry. The mayor of the town who got elected with labor support ended up denouncing the strike, and he armed police and militia units. On the left here you see these are the dock workers who supported the strike, and then the soldiers, a photograph of the soldiers who were there to maintain labor discipline. And basically the strike was it ran out of steam. There was quite a Red Scare going on, and it sort of fell apart. The victory that came out of the Seattle General Strike was that workers set up cooperatives, they set up grocery stores, and they set up soup kitchens for the strike. But in the end, what the police did was arrested most of the strike leaders. Many ended up being deported, and they were deported, even though they were born in the U.S., they were deported to Russia, deported to the new Soviet Union, and there many of them stayed. Now, just at the very end here, we know that what's coming up is the Great Depression and labor's great upsurge in the 1930s, the creation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Can you just welcome Dan Yates?
So what you are getting is the main gist of this talk today, which is on the big labor strike here in Muskegon back in 1881 and 82. Which is, you may not think is very important, but it really set the tone for the next, I'm going to say, 50 years in Muskegon in terms of labor organizing, and to some extent in the nation, and certainly in the state of Michigan. But before I get to that, no, I wanted the map, but at least it's working. Yes, there's a map that looks like this one on the front. He'll get to you, all right? Let me start, though, by picking up where you left off.
Are these all the same?
They're all the same. Some have a different cover. I thought I would be talking mostly to your paid students, not to your strike breakers.
Yeah. Well, we got all kinds.
We got all kinds in here, so I made up a special bunch for the tuition payers, but that isn't how they're being handed out. No, I want this one that's on the front. That's all right. Can you turn it around somehow?
I think I can.
There you go. Thank you. Well, I was trying to put together a PowerPoint, but my PowerPoint program wasn't cooperating. Went on strike on me, and I guess I didn't pay my union dues or something. But before I start, let's talk a little bit about the 30s. I'm wearing a button here. It's from the Federal Labor Union, which had a local affiliate, and it was apparently nationwide. And it started during the 30s with the breakup of the AFL and the CIO. The basic conflict within that organization was between company unions, which were the industrial unions, which were the CIO unions. In other words, everybody in the entire mine or everyone in the entire factory belonged to the union. And that linked skilled workers with semi-skilled workers with unskilled workers. Now, in a trade union, which was the AFL, everyone who was a member of the local was a carpenter or a machinist or a foundryman or something like that. So in the big factories, like automobile factories, and even in the mines, you had to mix them in together. So in a mine, for example, the actual miners were skilled workers. They had to know where to bore their holes. They had to know how much dynamite they could cram in there. They had to know how to light the fuses, and they had to know how much time they had to get out of the mine before they blew the thing up, see? Because they're extending that shaft out further. But then most of the workers in the mine were basically day laborers. They pick up the coal or the lead or the iron ore, and they shovel it into a hod and they cart it out, or do something like that. So they don't have to have high skill, but the miner does. In a factory, you're going to have machinists. They're high skill. You're going to have millwrights. They're high skill. But then you're going to have a guy working on the assembly line. He tightens a bolt every 2 seconds. Another bolt. You don't have to have great brains for that. You got to have tenacity. You got to have ways of avoiding boredom. But you can be replaced by somebody off the street. But you can't replace the millwright. So you have internal conflict within a union like that. And so when the AFL kicked out the CIO, they were left with a lot of unions, including those in Muskegon, that really didn't want to go with the CIO. Well, they wanted to stay with the AFL, but the AFL didn't want them. So they organized this separate entity, the Federal Union. And I don't know which plant this was from. I got them out of an estate sale, and I don't remember anything about the estate sale, but it depicts, I'm going to give one to your boss here. This is from 1936. So it's the very beginning of this separation from the AFL. And there's no such thing as right to work in Michigan yet, but there was at the same time no contract that required a company or a union shop. So if you worked, say, at Campbell, White and Cannon, you did not have to belong to the union. So these were pins that were given out to dues-paying members every 3 months. You paid your dues every quarter. And then you wear this pin around that says, I've paid for October, November, and December of 1936. And so that's a way of showing pride in union membership, but also sort of sticking it to the other people in the shop who had not paid their dues. And it's a device that I would suggest that maybe unions ought to start doing in today's world, where you have people who are sometimes members working alongside those who are not members. Anyway, that's just to bring you into the 1930s. I'm going to start with, I'm going to talk about the mills in Muskegon here in 1882. This is a map from 1881. The original was in the Hackley Library when I first started researching this topic back in the 60s. That's before some of you were born. And came to town. I came here on a bus from Kalamazoo. I didn't have a car. That was back when college students didn't have cars. We didn't have Nintendos. We didn't have Game Boys. Didn't have anything like that. So I got here on the bus and I went into the Hackley Library, and they had this huge map. They had a Muskegon room, which was up on the main floor at that time. It's now in the Torrent House across the street. And I said, could I get a copy of that map? Well, that map was like 5 feet wide and about 4 feet tall. And they said, well, yeah, can I take it out for a while? And I went around town looking for a place that could make a duplicate map. Now, this was 1964. We didn't have copy machines back then. We didn't have anything. The best I could find, after talking all over the city, was a drafting shop in Grand Rapids. So I somehow got over there, and I left it with them, and of course, I had not told the librarian I was going to do that, and they said, well, we can have it for you in a week. Boy. So, man alive, my butt was many different pieces. When I got back and explained to this nice old librarian, she was older than I am now, and but what was she to do? Now, of course, it worked out well because they not only got their map back, but they got umpteen copies of the map, and now they hand them out to anybody who's interested, so you can get that same map if you want to go there. This shows you the city of Muskegon in 1881, which is the year that the strike began. Now, at that time, there are 35 sawmills and what are called 35 sawmills in the city and the other communities. Now, this isn't all Muskegon. Muskegon goes about over to here. If you take a look, there's a map on the very back that shows you the city. So it's just that central portion. It's in 4 different colors. It starts out with kind of a pink, then a yellow, then a green, and then some other kind of a color as you get over to the west. That's all there is to the city. There's nothing beyond Getty. There's nothing south at all. There's Lakeside was a separate community, part of Laketon Township. As you know, Laketon Township is actually north of the lake, and they were administering Lakeside, Bluffton, and Port Sherman, but they were not connected physically to the township. So they're separate, but there were mills there. And then in North Muskegon, you have yet other mills, and then as you go out to the west, you find the mill out at Bay Mills, which is called Snug Harbor today. That's an old mill site. So all of those are mills. There are 35 of them. Now over to the right and the top, can we get back to that original map? You have what's called the booming grounds. Now the booming, see, every industry has a narrows of the trade, so to speak. In other words, if you're looking at this from the point of view of a labor organizer, where can you grab this industry and shut it down? Where would that be? I mean, ideally, looking at it from the point of view of a labor organizer, you know you're not going to be able to persuade everybody of your point of view. So where can you go that you can do the most effectiveness shutting down a business? And the booming grounds is where it is. The logs are coming from up the river. They're plopped into the river and they're brought down by river monkeys, or called by many different names. Mostly young men. Most of you would be too old for this work by now. You got to be young, agile, athletic, willing to get your butt dunked 2 or 3 times a day in April in the river. You're going to get knocked off the logs. And so they're bringing them down the river. And about where the Causeway Bridge is, that's where the booming ground was located. Now they're sorting the logs. Every log has a log mark at the end. And that means the mill it's just going to go. One mark will go to McCracken's mill, another will go to Hackley's mill, and so forth. And there's probably 500 different marks that are going to 35 different mills. So somebody has to decide where that goes. So they come down this sluice, and there's a worker called a boom hand, and his job is to look for certain logs with a certain mark. And if it's the right mark, it's the rooster, bring it in. These are not well-educated young men, but they can tell a rooster from a pig. And so we're pigs too. And so they bring in that particular log and put it into their boom. And then there's another group of men who are going to shackle them together with chains, turn them into a raft. And then at the other side of the boom, they're going to come out into a channel. And by that time, they're put into a raft. It's all chained together. And they'll be towed by a tugboat to the proper mill. This particular map shows some markings across it. Those are the zones. So if your mill is in zone 1 at the far right, then the booming company will charge you a certain amount to get that raft to that mill. If you're in the second zone, it's another amount. Third zone, another amount, and the fourth. So this may seem unfair if you're a long way from the boom, but when it comes to loading those ships full of lumber, the one at the far western end is going to be able to make an easier trip out into the Lake Michigan, than the one at the head. So it sort of evens out. All of these mill owners are members of the booming company. So the booming company is a corporation. It's sort of a stock company. You buy stock in the company, and therefore you get a vote on the board of directors. And so it really represents all of the mill owners on the lake. Doesn't necessarily represent the loggers. They could be the same as the sawmill owners, but often they're not part of that mix at all. So that's where the strike will begin, in the booming grounds. Now the booming company paid its ordinary workers about $1.75 a day, and they work by the day. Now they work 6 days a week, except when the weather was bad. If it was raining or if it was really foul weather, they would not get paid for that day. So the men went on strike. This was in late September of 1881, toward the end of the season. The season normally ended at the end of October, early November, because the weather gets to be too bad to work beyond that outside. So they went on strike. Two demands. One was that they wanted more pay. They wanted a raise to $2 an hour, and they wanted to be paid for the days they couldn't work. Those are fairly reasonable demands, depending upon your point of view. But the mill owners, the booming company, thought about it a day or two, and they said, all right, we'll give you the extra quarter a day. Now, they're working 11.5-hour days, you understand. So these are long days. And there's really not much of a break during the day except for about a half an hour to an hour for lunch. And they live in a boarding house run by the company, and so the company gets some of that back in terms of room and board payments. So it may sound generous, it may not sound generous, but you need to see the bigger picture. They would not agree to pay for the days off, however, in bad weather. And of course, September, you're starting to see more bad weather. Now, the men were on strike for 3 days, and the mill owners talked it over, and some of them figure, they're fairly reasonable men, that this was not such a bad demand. After all, men aren't expecting fewer hours to work. Well, why don't we give in, and we'll, at least for the remainder of this year, pay them for those days that they have to take off because of bad weather. And so that was settled. Well, that, of course, was sort of meat for the grinder in terms of the mill workers. They were working on the same basic schedule, 11.5 hours a day, and 6 days a week. They'd normally start at 6:30 and maybe 6, and they would then end at 6:30 or 7, but each mill was a little bit different. The mills called you to work with a mill whistle, and every whistle was a little different. So normally you lived in a boarding house or at least near the mill, and you knew your whistle was different from the other whistles. And of course, even if it was similar, 3 toots as opposed to 2 toots, or they had codes that would identify each mill. So the mill would usually tell you with a whistle about half an hour before you were expected at work, and then another whistle when you were expected to start work, which about half an hour later. So that was pretty standard, and as long as you knew what your whistle said, where to go, then you were all right. Now, if you didn't get there by the time work started, many of these jobs were so easy to learn that you would simply be replaced. And now, again, a mill is a varied employment. You had in the mill some skilled workers, you had some semi-skilled workers, you had some unskilled workers. The most skilled workers were the sawyers, and there were usually 2 or 3 in every mill. The head sawyer did most of the sawing. These are circular saws. They're maybe 5 feet in diameter, and they're very heavy contraptions. And so you're slicing off a segment of that log with every pass of the log. Some of them were 2 ways. They could go saw this way and saw back this way. You really had to watch out for them because you could get hit coming and going. Once those slabs had been prepared, they're sent off to the tail sawyer, and he cuts the ends off to make them square. And then they're sent off to the side sawyer, and he cuts off the sides, getting as much lumber out of it as he possibly can. He might also, the end sawyer might also saw out any knots that might be in there. See, these logs will come in up to 16 feet long typically, sometimes longer. And so you might be able to cut out an offended section and make it a 12-footer, and then you use the other for scrap or something like that. So there are several different products. Those are all skilled workers. The saws only last about 2 hours, and then they have to be replaced. Now, everybody continues working while they're being replaced, but you got to take off the old blade, you have to put on a new blade, and then that old blade goes off to the filer, and the filer is another skilled worker. He sharpens the saws, basically. That's his whole job. Every day he's filing on some saw to make it a better saw, a blade, that is. Then there are what are called doggers and setters. They make up these names to make them cute, but they're basically responsible for rotating the log on the logging plane, and getting it ready. So they have to know a little bit. But then most of the other workers are just toting around pieces of saw, the saw to take it to another place, or the planks to get them to someplace else, or they're sweeping up the floor. The Hollanders, they were out there in the yard stacking those huge piles of logs. They loved Germans and Dutchmen because they always made them perfectly vertical. We Scotch-Irish just can't imagine this. Well, ain't that good enough? It's falling over. Yeah. Well, somebody could get hurt. Well, the hell with them. We don't need to. But though some of these people are just plain perfect. Well, they just love that kind of worker. I'm part German too, so I'm part Dutch for that matter. All right, so I'm sort of picking on myself. All right, so beg your pardon?
How straight is that line?
That's not mine. No, I wouldn't do that. So the sawmill workers decided, well, the boom hands had such an easy job of getting what they wanted. We have some demands as well. One of the big concerns they had was what was called time stealing. Most of the businesses were accused of this at one time or another, but the way it worked in this case was in some mills, and I say some mills, they would toot the whistle early. See, nobody had a watch except the management. I mean, it's a time-honored irony that the first watch a man ever gets is when he retires. Now, I am retired. I need a watch like I need another hole in my head. When did I need a watch? When I was working to make sure that I didn't get cheated, see? Well, again, not all mills. Some mills did, some mills didn't. They would toot their horns 15 minutes early, or they tooted 15 minutes late at the end of the day. It was obvious because the other mills were behaving themselves, doing exactly according to the... Now, again, keep in mind, there was a time you could get away with this because every town had its own time zone. You determined noon when the sun was directly overhead. But by the 1880s, the railroads had forced upon this country a uniform time system, so we started having time zones. So everything within that time zone, when we still have it today, had to be on the same time scheme, and they could keep accurate accounts. So by the 1880s, it was becoming very difficult to deceive even the dumbest worker that his day should start 15 minutes before anybody. Maybe you could figure out when noon was, but you can't figure out, all the other clocks are the same. Why are we being cheated? So that was an issue with some of the men. With other men, I think they had a long-term grudge. When we take a look at the names of the men who went on strike and the leaders, some of them were very young, 20, 21 years old. A lot of the workers were young. But the older veterans were veterans of the Civil War. Now, it's sort of like that today. You have veterans who are working in a factory, and you probably don't want to mess with them. They're probably really good workers. They will follow orders. They will do what they are expected to do, but you're not going to push them around because they've seen war. They've seen people die. They've killed other people. They know how to use guns. All right? So this was a big issue with this Civil War crowd. Millions of men had gone to war, but there's one great group in Muskegon that did not go to war, and guess who that was? The mill owners. You can go down one name after another. I can check them against my register of Civil War veterans. Former students of mine are hard workers. She's no longer living, but she's a genealogist. She did a study, found literally thousands of Muskegon County veterans. If this man went to war and lived any time in Muskegon County, she knows about it and what unit they were in. So I can check them against the accounts. There is not but one Muskegon lumberman who served in the Civil War. His name was Ducey. He was a partner of Torrent, had his own mill. He joined before he became a Muskegon lumberman. He was in Wisconsin. I have a couple from the White Lake area, Noah Ferry and Hiram Staples, but that's it. Nothing else in Muskegon. In fact, during the war, some of the older citizens who were survivors of Mexican-American War felt sorry for the women who were left behind by their soldier husbands who had to go to war. The Army isn't always good at paying military men their due, and of course these women were destitute. They had no income while their husbands were at war. So these good gentlemen went around town to all the lumbermen asking for a loan. Could you loan us $100 and you'll eventually get it back when these women get their husbands' paychecks, their Army dues. How much money do you think they got from those lumbermen? Not one red penny. Not even a 10-cent. I mean, so there's bad blood here. I mean, if you were a Civil War veteran and you went to war and you lost a buddy or maybe were injured yourself, you would think about these guys as slackers, certainly. And so that's an undercurrent that you need to keep in mind. I don't think that's the big issue, but it certainly didn't improve relations with the mill owners. All right, so they decided to go on strike. Now, this is a very unusual strike because as soon as and we're talking about 3,000 to 4,000 workers going on strike. It's hard to tell who was a real striker and who was simply out of work because the mill was shut down. We know that the crowds that gathered were numbering in the 3,000 to 4,000 neighborhood. The other hand, when they formed a union, they had 1,200 paying members. So not everybody belonged to the union. My guess is that the 1,200 were honest-to-goodness dues payers. There was another 100 men who were the filers and the sawyers. They formed a separate union, which of course you would expect them to do because they're skilled workers compared to unskilled. And that's another 100. And I'm guessing maybe half of the rest were sympathetic with the strike, and the other half were just out of work. They would have been willing to probably to go to work if the strikers had been more cooperative. So that's the gist of it. Now, what's unique about this is that these meetings that they had attracted a lot more attention than did any other meetings in town. They were on strike for about a month, but during this time, every day they would have meetings at the Liberty Pole or at Riefenberg's Hall. Liberty Pole was about where the old mall used to be. And Riefenberg's Hall later on was called, it was an appliance store. Walt Plant had an appliance store on Terrace and Western. The House of Chan was on the second story. They had a restaurant. That's Riefenberg's Hall, or it goes back to the 1880s. Or that's where they would meet typically. If they had a small enough group like the organizing committee, they'd meet at Riefenberg's. Otherwise, they'd meet at the Liberty Pole or some other. Mason's Park was another one. That was, again, in that same general neck of the woods. So these were big labor organizers. And the unique thing about it is the extent to which they received support from the community. The community is divided. The strikers themselves had mill owners who were backing them, who were supporting them. And, of course, the mill owners who were opposing them. Well, they got into late October, and by that time, about half of the mills, 16 of them, had gone back to work on the 10-hour plan for the remainder of that year. Another few, 6, 7, had gone back to work on the 11-hour plan, but they did not have a full staff. They couldn't operate at full bore, and the others were simply closed. Now, some of these mills had been closed, I'm going to say by force. The mills right in Muskegon, if we can go to that other map.
Sure, the colored map.
Yes, please. I'll show you what I mean. That part I was telling you about right here in the middle, those mills were closed right away, right along the lake there. And those are all in the city. Now, Lakeside was further to the west. The men had to march there and close those down by brute force. In other words, make a show of force and force them to close. That's Newcomb McGrath was out there, and Montgomery and Mahan and a bunch of other, McCracken is out there. And so they were not quite so willing, but they eventually closed. And then the Nelson Mill, which was out at the mouth. Then that same day they marched over to North Muskegon. There wasn't any causeway then. They marched across on the railroad bridge, and they closed down all of those mills. There was some squabbling, but they closed them down peacefully. I don't know what happened to Bay Mills. I don't think they ever got there. I don't know what happened. I suppose they closed as well. Haven't found anything about them. So they closed those mills down, but the season was coming to an end. Most of these same workers went to work in the woods. They were working for loggers and other companies, not necessarily their own mill owners, for the winter. So they'd go out in the woods. Or sometimes our sawmill hands would go down south. The southern lumber industry was almost the opposite of the northern industry. Most of their activity was done in the winter. You can imagine in South Carolina or Mississippi working in the middle of the summer there. You don't want to do that if you can help it. And in the South, the basic rule of thumb was blacks in, whites out. So if you worked in a sawmill in the South, you were black probably, because it was hot, steamy, difficult work. And if you were white, you usually worked out in the woods. And so in the wintertime, a lot of these northern workers would go down south and work in the woods down there. Or they'd work on railroads down there. Again, the work is very similar to the work you would do in a lumber camp. So they're going elsewhere. Now in the winter, that's when the organizing occurred. These men started thinking, how are we going to be able to get things going in the spring? And they thought, well, why not get involved politically? So this is really one of the very first episodes where workers, led by some community political leaders, formed their own political party. They called it the Working Man's Party, organized in February of 1882. They're led by Nelson DeLong. I had his picture up there a minute ago. He's kind of a chubby-faced fellow with a beard. That's Nelson DeLong. He was the county prosecuting attorney at that time. He became the leader of the movement, along with his partner Francis Cook, who also was one of the agitators, and a planing mill owner by the name of William Jones was another one. They bring in some high-powered labor leaders from Detroit to give speeches as well. So they organized this party and ran an entire slate of candidates headed by Nelson DeLong for municipal office in Muskegon. DeLong ran for mayor, and another man, I won't bother you with him because I don't have his picture, ran for city treasurer, and then they elected or nominated 4 aldermen. Now an alderman, can we go to that color map again, Nick, please? There are 4 wards. Each of these colors represents a different ward. Each ward had 2 aldermen. You elected an alderman every year, so they have a 2-year term, but they're elected in alternate years. So this year they had 4 openings. The Working Men's Union ran 4 candidates. They had 2 men who were Civil War veterans, but they were planing mill operators. They had another guy who ran a store, and another fellow, I've forgotten his identity, but one of them was a sawyer from one of the mills. And they're pretty much all Civil War vets, and they ran on a ticket. Now, the other 2 parties, that is the Democrats and the Republicans, normally were at each other's throats in the municipal elections, just as they were in the state and national elections. And they normally would be running candidates in the spring. But this time, they figured we don't have a great chance of getting elected if we divide ourselves, let these working men's people get elected. We need to band together. So the old leadership of the parties got together and decided on a common slate of candidates for these same offices. Elections came in April, and the Working Men's Party won 3-1. It was just absolutely mind-boggling. Nothing like that had ever happened. And they got them all elected. Well, things didn't fare so well for the strikers. As soon as he was elected, DeLong was under challenge from his political enemies. They accused him of all manner of misdemeanors and felonies. As attorney of the county attorney, they accused him of accepting bribes from criminals so that they could get off lightly and all sorts. So he was kept busy defending himself. Nothing was ever proven against him, and it may not have been anything against him. We don't know. He resigned from that office, anyway, and continued on as mayor. The strikers went back to work, and they again closed the mills down, except for those that were willing to operate on 10 hours, about half of them. And that still allowed some of these other mills to operate. They induced the boom hands to go out and strike again. Again, that's a vital narrows. It's a way of closing down the entire lake pretty effectively. They went out on a sympathy strike. And so you had about roughly 3,500. Well, no, you had some of them back to work. You had probably 2,500 or so still men out of work, strikers or people who had gone out of work because the mill was closed. Eventually, of course, the workers tired of going without pay. I mean, when they came back from the camps in the winter, they had paychecks, but you know how some of these workers were. They spent them on loose women and liquor and gambling, and so some of them were not sustained as long as they might have. But then there was also some violence. Well, you got to take the good with the bad. I've been involved in the labor movement, and we've got some things you just as soon keep under wraps, you know. I mean, that's the way it is. So you have, they tried to shut down the mills in North Muskegon, and they did that, but then they went to Lakeside, and they came into some trouble at the McCracken mill. It's on the map there. It's right there in Lakeside. And there was some fighting. Some of the workers there didn't want to go off the job, and they got into a fight with some of the strikers, and they threw some punches, and it wasn't no bloodshed, you know, no bullets or great bloodshed, but still there was some damage, and that sort of softened some of the support for the strike. So the strike sort of petered out after that, and they went back to work on the basis of some mills operating on 10 hours, some mills operating on 11 hours. So that's an improvement for everybody because the old standard was 11 and a half, so they saved an hour. But by and large, they went back to work on the company terms. In the meantime, the boom hands had been replaced by strike breakers. The boom company brought in some boom hands from Canada, which is not unusual. A lot of the boom hands were Canadians anyway. And they came in, and they had to march from the depot, which is where it is today, to the booming grounds, about, say, a mile. And, of course, they were accompanied by 2,000 strikers. And on the way to the booming grounds, they decided they'd just as soon go back to Canada. Thank you very much. So they turned around and went back to the depot and went back on the train. Well, the company wasn't going to deal with that. They brought in another 100 and some new strike breakers, and they were able to get them to the boom, guarded by Pinkerton guards, armed guards who were brought in to give them protection. They were put into a new set of boarding houses. I can't get this quite straight, but roughly I think the boarding houses were put about where the Getty Street plant, the old Teledyne or the L3 plant is today. The company owned that land, and that's where they... So the workers were separated from everybody else. They had their own dining hall, they had their own boarding house. They didn't have to mingle with the locals, which of course was good for them because they might have gotten into some trouble otherwise. And so that pretty much ended the strike. But it sounds kind of gloomy if you're a labor supporter. But this is what happened after the strike. The working men had shown they could win an election, and they could win it big. They won the mayoralty position in 82, they won it again in 84, they won it in 86, they won it in 88, and on and on. And even when it sort of fell into disuse, there were always working men or sympathizers to workers who were willing to run for these offices. So essentially, the workers gained control of city government for the next, I'm going to say 20 to 30 years easily. Basically because they learned they could win. They could organize, they could do just like these other guys did. Now again, a bit of that is due to the changes in government. You understand that the voting systems were different then than they are today. The Australian ballot that we sort of use today, even though they're hanging chads now, but it's the same concept. It's the same ballot that everybody gets. And that came in about the 1890s, early 20th century. Before that, you got your ballot from the party table. Each party, or if there were three, all three parties had a table at the election place. You went to this table and got your ballot from the Democrats, or you went to that table and got your ballot from the Republicans. The only names on that ballot were the names they wanted you to vote for. See, the Republicans, the Democrats, or the third party if there was one. So you basically could mark an X at the top, vote straight ticket, which many people did, or you could mark each individual box if you wanted, or you could write a name in and cross off the one that was there. So you could vote for somebody else, but if you didn't know how to write, that was a problem. On the other hand, the other party would have little stickers that you could get, and you could paste over the name that was there if you knew which one that was. So it was kind of skewed, and many of the mills, this worked both sides of the tent because the mill owners were both Democrats and Republicans. They would take all of their workers to the same polling place at the same time in company wagons and have them all vote. But it wasn't really just Republicans, it was Democrats doing this as well. And so that's all gone by the 1890s. And we have the Australian ballots, so you can vote your conscience pretty much. You know, you get one ballot and you get to vote for whomever you want, plus you can write a name. So that has happened as well. Now, of course, during the strike, there were no mill wagons to take anybody. So that's another reason why the workers probably did as well as they did. So anyway, that's one important change. Second change, Francis Cook, who was the partner of Nelson DeLong, that same year, 82, ran for state representative. And he won handily. The entire district supported him on the working man's ticket again. He went to Lansing and began campaigning for progressive causes. He ran again in 84, was reelected, and then when he got reinforcements, fellow congressmen, fellow representatives, they started passing laws. At the local level, some of those laws, all right, well, they passed, for example, the 10-hour labor bill in 1885. There were enough of them there, they were able to establish 10 hours as a day's labor throughout the state of Michigan. Wasn't always easily enforced, but it was a law that was on the books now for all factories. And of course, some were working on the 8-hour day too. But that was the maximum you could work, again, 6 days a week. They passed some laws. I'm working on a book now on the medical history of Muskegon County. The same group will pass in 1883 the first law in Michigan that required physicians to register their profession. The backers wanted a bill that would say you have to have a college degree. That didn't get in the bill. They wanted to be able to say you had to pass an examination at the state level. That didn't get in the bill. But they did manage to get at least registration so that if you knew where to look, you could find out that your doctor had a college degree, or this other guy's doctor took a correspondence course and learned about plants someplace. And who knows what he knew about anything else. Or she. There were some women doctors too at that time. They passed a dental registration bill. In that bill, you actually had to be a college degreed person to be a dentist after 1883. 1885, they passed another law that stipulated things about drugstores, actually requiring, get this, that you actually had to know something about pharmacology to run a drugstore. You know, you could sell drugs as long as they were patent drugs and had labels on them, but if you were mixing together compounds, you actually had to have a degree from an institution and prove to a state examining board that you... Now, these are progressive changes that had been difficult to pass up until that time. Here in Muskegon, again, because of the influence of this group, they have a state, they have a convention which was open to anybody in the state on health care in Muskegon. Up until 1883, you got your water from your own well, which was right next to your cesspool or your outhouse. Now, I don't have to tell you, this is not the healthiest of conditions, not in a place where hogs and cattle and horses were allowed to roam the streets. You built a picket fence around your house, not to make it look pretty, but to keep out the pigs and the chickens and the horses and the cows that were grazing out in the street. you see. So they're pooping everywhere, and you don't know what kind of handicaps they're presenting. And so the groundwater was just filthy. It was polluted. So this group will bring this convention to town, led by druggists and physicians in town, encouraged by the workers, and they will discuss this matter of the lack of a water system, and they get one built within another year. They talked about the lack of a hospital. There was no hospital in Muskegon at that time, not one. You had to go to Big Rapids to find the nearest hospital. Big Rapids! I mean, it's like going to Millet if you follow, well, that's another TV show, but that's the boondocks to get to. And that was a Catholic hospital, and the Protestants weren't going to go there under any circumstances. So they're talking about this. They finally do, a private group of merchants and businessmen and druggists built their own city hospital. And they opened it up to any worker who could pay to come in, or you could buy a subscription to give you access to the hospital for the remainder of the year. Now, not one lumberman supported that, but they still put it in. It was small, it was not adequate, but it was a big step, called the Hauber Hospital. They will create, for the first time, Muskegon Central Trades Association, Labor and Trades Association. This is a central union for Muskegon, 1885. This is one of the very first in the whole state of Michigan. The only other one was Detroit. They had a big labor center. So all the unions in town had a common meeting place where they could all gather. You had the cigar makers, you had the molders, you had the carpenters and joiners. You had all these unions. There are about 15 of them, skilled labor unions pretty much, plus the working ones, and of course the Knights of Labor. These were sort of bourgeois labor supporters. They had 3 units here in Muskegon. They were members as well. Important gain, and that has continued on till today. I mean, there's still a Trades and Labor Association under a different name. They will have the second Labor Day parade in the whole state of Michigan, 1890. We have them every year today. I don't know if there's been a gap, but we've been having Labor Day parades here in Muskegon since 1890, right down Western Avenue at that time. So major gains. And then, of course, these continue on into the 20th century, up until the 30s. Again, the 30s is another time. Maybe I can come back another time and talk about organizing efforts in the 30s. But they really were, we had all these locally owned businesses. Campbell, White and Cannon, Shaw Walker, Holbein Brown Morris. Their owners were local. And they typically tended to be paternalistic owners. That is to say, they liked their workers, the ones they kept. They had a regular relationship with them. They knew their families. I worked for a company that was like that in Port Huron, even in the 60s, Mueller Brass. They had a company picnic every year. As a kid, I would run in the races and even win them then. I was a little thinner then. And then the owner would come out and shake hands with every worker, and he'd say, well, how's the family? How's your wife? And they'd know the wife's name. And, oh, is this the youngest one? Oh, I really treated their workers properly, but they were paternalistic. In other words, it was going to be their way. And you'd better not show much resistance to them because, well, they eventually unionized, and, of course, that owner then sold out to a corporation. So that all ended. The same thing was happening here in Muskegon, though, in the same years. But say at Campbell, White and Cannon, we can document this. They had their core of workers, but there were a bunch of on-skilled positions that were open to the shake-up, it was called. And many companies operated that way. Have you come to the shake-up yet? Well, you basic, if you wanted a job, it's during the 30s.
And maybe you might want to take 1 or 2 questions.
All right, well, during the 30s, of course, a lot of people were out of work. And so if you didn't have a job, you'd go to any place that seemed to be hiring. Campbell, White and Cannon was one of them. And on a given day, they might need to have 40 or 50 workers, depending upon how much work they had. So they'd basically take whoever was out there in the yard and had not caused them any trouble in the past, and they would get a job for that day. But then probably you'd have to come back the next day to get that chance at that same job. Again, they might like you and hire you on a regular basis, but it was a very insecure basis for workers at that time. But again, not all workers were treated that way. Again, these are newcomers to town or unskilled workers. If you were skilled, that was a different story entirely.
For coming in, and can we give him a
No.
give him a hand? Thanks.
I'll stick around for a little bit.
All right.
Thank you.